أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، الرحمن الرحيم، مالك يوم الدين. إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين، اهدنا الصراط المستقيم، صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. آمين. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. يا أيها الذين آمنوا ما لكم إذا قيل لكم انفروا في سبيل الله اثاقلتم إلى الأرض أرضيتم بالحياة الدنيا من الآخرة فما متاع الحياة الدنيا في الآخرة إلا قليل إلا تنفروا يعذبكم عذابا أليما ويستبدل قوما غيركم ولا تضروه شيئا والله على كل شيء قدير. إلا تنصروه فقد نصره الله إذ أخرجه الذين كفروا ثاني اثنين إذ هما في الغار إذ يقول لصاحبه لا تحزن إن الله معنا فأنزل الله سكينته عليه وأيده بجنود لم تروها وجعل كلمة الذين كفروا السفلى وكلمة الله العليا والله عزيز حكيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. قل هو الله أحد الله الصمد لم يلد ولم يولد ولم يكن له كفوا أحد. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. قل أعوذ برب الفلق من شر ما خلق ومن شر غاسق إذا وقب ومن شر النفاثات في العقد ومن شر حاسد إذا حسد. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. قل أعوذ برب الناس ملك الناس إله الناس من شر الوسواس الخناس الذي يوسوس في صدور الناس من الجنة والناس. صدق الله العظيم.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu, and greetings to all of you who are online this afternoon. Peace and blessings upon our Master and our Nabi Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. I welcome each and every one of you to this series of seminars that we've been having, or rather, I should use the word webinars, because that is exactly what this is. It's a seminar on the web, hence the term webinar. And I want to say a welcome not just to all of our South African participants, but also to our international participants. I am told and advised that we have participants from Indonesia, Brussels, Kosovo, Lesotho, and of course, all the different parts of South Africa. And I also want to, at this particular point in time, want to extend a thank you to all our partners. This program has been brought to you in partnership with various organizations. And these are Awqaf South Africa, AMAL, the Association of Muslim Accountants and Lawyers, Sanzaf, which is the South African National Zakat Fund, and UUCSA, which is the United Ulama Council of South Africa. Now, for those of you who've attended before, you know very well that this is not the first of the webinars. In fact, this is a series of webinars that are being conducted on the issues of corporate governance. And here we're targeting specifically Muslim organizations or Muslim NPOs. Now, we've had at least 3 already. The very first one was quite an introductory one on what are all the issues that and the challenges that are facing some of our NPOs. And then we had the second one, which was basically dealing with ethics. So how do we actually create an ethical NPO? And the third one was around risk management and internal controls. Today, we're focusing on 2 very, very important aspects of corporate governance as well. So we're looking at the composition of the board or the board itself and the skills that is required by the board members. And then we're looking at succession planning. And one would ask, well, you know, why have we chosen these particular topics? And we must understand that our purpose in the dunya obviously is to please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And most of these organizations have been founded on the basis of either maintaining or presenting or doing dawah on Islamic ideology. And if these particular organizations have not founded themselves correctly, managed themselves, governed themselves, etc., then they're going to be flailing organizations, and we're not going to be able to obviously reach that objective that we have in mind. So these are really, really important issues that we want to deal with this afternoon. Now, like I've said, that we've had previous seminars, but today is not the end, because this is an onward journey. I like when we were planning this particular webinar, and when I went on board, I remember, I think I should say Brother Suleman, who said to me that this was founded in a coffee shop between him and Zainul Kaji, and they basically came up, I used the term, they gave birth to this idea of this whole project on corporate governance for Islamic NPOs. And so you can look forward to those of you who have been attending quite diligently, you can look forward to quite a few more seminars in the series. There's one coming up. The next one would be sometime in January, and then a monthly seminar thereafter. And I think 2 perhaps in February, March, April, etc. So it is a long-term project that has been embarked upon, and I think a very, very important one at that. Before we actually move on, I just want to go over a few house rules that we need to bear in mind while we're participating in the webinar this afternoon. So remember that all of the participants, their videos and their audios have been muted. So any questions or communication that you want to make, please do so via the chat that is afforded to you on the tab at the bottom of your screen where it says chat. And clearly I can see already that some of the questions have been coming through on the chat, and they are being attended to. Then we also need to alert you to the fact, and so you can share this with those who are not participating in the webinar, that in fact this session is being live streamed at the moment on the Awqaf SA's YouTube page, which is Awqaf South Africa. And you may subscribe to that channel for future broadcasts as well. And then again, another announcement. I'm sure you're going to be very, very interested in what our speakers have lined up for you today. So what I'm going to basically say to you is that the slides that the speakers are going to be speaking to will be emailed to all the attendees post the event, and it will also be available on the Awqaf website. I will give you very, very quickly what that website address is: www.awqafsa.org.za/corporate governance. Now, I'm sure all of you at the moment are seeing something on your screen, and that is a poll question that we have for you. So please do, I think some of you have already been attending to answering it, but does your NPO board as a collective have the required skills set? So please do answer that question, and we will revert on that particular question towards the end of the webinar. Thank you. Just going to give you a few more minutes, or rather a minute, to round up your questions. If you have, then I'm going to continue with the program. Okay. Now, I must tell you that in preparing this webinar, we have always handpicked the people who we want to address you on the specific issues that we're dealing with. And so we have done the very same for this particular webinar as well. And I must say to you that as the attendees, you're very fortunate. When I'm going to tell you about the speakers, you will realize that these are definitely experts in the field that we're dealing with. So the very first speaker that we have lined up today, and who is going to be speaking to you on board effectiveness, is Mr. Yunus Suleman. Now, he comes with an extensive background in working in this particular area, but a very, very quick sort of overview of what his educational background is. He has a Bachelor of Commerce. He has an honors in BComt, which he obtained from UNISA. He is a chartered accountant, which means that he has taken those tedious board exams and has done successful, and therefore has now earned the title of chartered accountant. He's an executive partner development program in GIBS, and that was in 2008. Also, he has a business leadership program, which he also has obtained certain skills from. Now, when we look at his collective experience, we're looking at about 35 years worth of experience in the accounting and auditing profession. And in the last 5 years, he has spent his time as an independent, non-executive director. Now, he wears many hats, so he serves on many different organizations and boards, and that's what I mean when I say to you that he comes with this extensive experience, very, very rich in all of the organizations that he has served on. And a lot of that is available on the bio and on his slide as well. So without much ado, I'm going to ask Mr. Suleman to now take over.
Assalamu alaikum and good afternoon to everyone. So, my topic, as you've heard from the Munira, essentially is about board effectiveness. And essentially, before I get into the, let's call it the heart of the presentation, I just want to make a few introductory comments. And essentially, if you look at it from a non-profit organization point of view, where generally speaking, non-executives or directors of these non-profit organizations do not necessarily get paid. Effectively, most of, not all of them, are volunteers. So essentially, I think that is a fundamental difference between a corporate company and a non-profit organization, where essentially there's not many people that are queuing up to get involved in an organization where there's not significant, let's say, incentive. And that, I think, is a fundamental difference. But I'll get into the actual crux of it, and maybe we'll touch a bit more later, where I will talk about a specific, call it example, of where I've been involved over the last 6 years. But the King 4 code, which I hope some of you are aware of, but internationally you may not be aware, there's a thing called the King 4, which is a judge in South Africa was responsible, Judge Mervyn King, to develop this code, which essentially will drive the effectiveness of boards, but be driven by ethical and effective standards. So the governing body, which we refer to, is the board of, let's call it directors, or the board of members that effectively manage an organization and has to lead that ethically and effectively. If I get to the next slide, what does effective leadership mean? Effective leadership is exemplified by a number of core qualities which are pretty self-explanatory. You take it for granted that people need to have integrity, to be able to be competent to do the job. And we find competence sometimes is lacking when it comes to non-profit organizations because of the point I made earlier, where people are not queuing up to get involved. And when you have your normal AGMs, you tend to just take whoever is available to get involved without necessarily focusing on the actual qualities, the experience, and the competence that's required from members that should be part of the board. And in a number of organizations I've come across, I mean, ultimately, it's about taking whoever's available. And when you compare that to a normal corporate board, there's a lot more stricter controls of who is, let's call it, acceptable to become a board member, whether it's a listed company or a corporate out there that may not be listed. So there's a lot more stringent rules. And that's something which is a major differentiating factor between what we would call a non-profit organization and a corporate. I think whenever we take any role, you have to be responsible. You have to make commitment for time. You have to be accountable to the board or to your members, wherever they may be. And in whatever you do, ultimately, you've got to be fair and look at what is the purpose of the organization. Is it fair in whatever you're doing? And the rest of the points on that screen are pretty self-explanatory. Consultation is very important. You must be clear in terms of justice, trust, excellence, and transparency. When you look at effective leadership, it has to be results-driven. Now, what does that mean? To be results-driven, you have to have the right structure. And to achieve the right structure, you need to look at the different, let's call it, committees that you need to set up, and then have a level of accountability that is such where there's a clear monitoring of what people are capable of and what they should be doing. Now, when you look at a nonprofit organization, and the one that I was involved, or I'm still involved in, when I got involved, as I said, 6 years ago, I looked at it and I thought, okay, this organization is a global organization in 9 different regions around the world, but there isn't structure. And the actual constitution literally doesn't necessarily provide for the structure that we require. So essentially what we had to do was relook at the entire structure and put basic subcommittees in place, and to put, let's call it, an overarching monitoring vehicle. In a normal corporate environment, you would call that an executive committee that would be monitored by the board. But in this environment, the board and the executive committee effectively is effectively equivalent to the same. So we started with setting up an overarching executive committee, and then looked at each sub-region and made sure that within that sub-region, the right people are appointed as what we would then call vice president of the region, and then an assistant secretary general, as well as a treasurer, reporting to that executive committee. But within that executive committee as well, we needed to look at how do we structure the executive committee to focus on portfolios, and those portfolios will then focus on accountability from the different regions. So essentially, that's the sort of thing that's important. So you can be results driven, but you have to have the right structure. in the nonprofit organization in achieving the highest level of performance. And that's achieved by monitoring of what you need to do. We go to the next slide. You talk about servant leadership. Most companies call themselves a management committee or an executive committee. But when you talk about servant leadership, and often we focus on non-profit organizations, especially from an Islamic perspective, it's all for the pleasure of Allah. And when you look at what does servant leadership mean, should you call yourself a servco, which is a servant committee for the pleasure of Allah, versus a management committee? And that committee has to be very much, let's call it, focus on the 5 or 6 qualities we've got on that on the screen, which is the commitment, and it's a commitment of time. And the fact of the matter is time is more valuable than just giving money. And that's something that's not always freely available. When you look at compassion and passion and dedication, it's all about who are you serving, who are your members, and what is it you're looking to do. And when you look, most Islamic organizations get involved in Zakat, like you've got Sanzaf on the co-host. And you have to make sure that whatever you receive in Zakat is distributed to the large degree, as much as possible, as 100% of what you receive should be distributed. And that's something that's not always done, because you do need an executive that run the organization that have to be paid. But my own view is that as far as possible, we should be using lillah and sort of call it non-Zakat funds to actually fund the operating cost. And the rest of the point on that screen is selflessness and taqwa is critical in the pursuit of pleasure of Allah. Now, when you look at governance and about right leadership, what does that mean? You could say do the right things in the right way, but you have to look around your, let's call it, portfolios and make sure it's done in such a way that it is the right way, but you have to set the platform for that. Now, one of the things that we set up in this organization I referred to was to set up what we call a legal and compliance subcommittee. And that legal and compliance subcommittee would actually monitor the actual, let's call it, ethical leadership we're talking about, and how we can make sure that everything is done in the appropriate manner. And that, I think, is the fundamental thing. If you've got a monitoring mechanism, then ultimately you will achieve the right leadership in the right way. If we look at the next slide, and this is very much just touching on the Companies Act, but if you look at most companies out there that are non-profit organizations, they're very much based on the platform called a Section 21 company, which is a company set up using the Companies Act for non-profit purposes. Now, in the points that are raised here, it's very much driven about the ethical role that you play as a board member. You cannot use your position or the information that you gain out of your position for your personal use, as could harm the actual nonprofit organization. So whatever you do and how do you carry yourself has to be in good faith and for the best interest of the company with the right degree of care, skill, and diligence. If we go to the next slide, I think ultimately there has been a sort of study conducted back in 2013 on 40 corporate disasters that concluded that almost all the root cause risks we identified ultimately originate from boards. And that's very much where the structure or the accountability was really not there in terms of making sure we focus on the actual right areas in identifying issues that may surface. Now, this point really focuses on risk management. And ultimately, as Munira had mentioned, that previously this corporate governance series talked about risk as well. You have to have a risk management platform, and you have to look at the risks that impact you as an organization and how are those risks managed. And so that's the critical foundation that needs to be set in managing those risks. And there's a number of legislative requirements for a nonprofit organization to make sure that when they receive their funds, that it's not coming from, let's call it, illicit activities, etc. And if you've got the right practical processes in place, you'll be able to manage that. And therefore, as I said, if you've got the right structure, you'll avoid this question of risk blindness. And if you pick the right people, you'd have the right skills and the right level of independent non-executive directors that influence the right ethical leadership. Information that's presented to the board has to be challenged And that's the point of what information is given by management to the board. You need to challenge that, and you need to make sure that it's proper and it's the right information, which also builds the right leadership ethos and culture. And we need to avoid having dominant and charismatic leaders, because as you said, that is a root cause that contributes to the issues around corporate disasters. And the bottom line, as I said, is about the effectiveness of the board has a huge impact on the success of the organization and the funding that comes to that organization. If you look at the next slide, I mean, just to summarize in a few points, you have to be dedicated to refining and fulfilling the mission. That changes all the time based on circumstances. You have to be clear in the engagement of the board and the selection of the board. Now, as I said right up front, unfortunately, there are not a situation that you have in corporates where there are lots of people looking to join boards, whereas in non-profit organizations, we don't have the luxury of being selective. But this is something I would try to inculcate, that we need to be able to move towards not necessarily corporatizing, but using that platform to get the best people. And as I mentioned a few minutes ago about organizing the structure, the responsibilities, setting the goals, and measuring the performance of the board. And that comes with, at the normal AGM or normal feedback sessions, you can then get feedback and make sure that the boards are held accountable. I think in terms of hiring an excellent CEO, like we've got in this situation with Awqaf, you've got Zainal, who drives the organization extremely well. You have to have the right processes to hire people like Zainal and compensate them well to ensure that the right ethical standards are inculcated in the management teams as well. And ultimately, I think you've got to act with the belief and knowledge that the board governs while the staff manages and executes whatever functions is allocated to them. If you get to the next slide, we talk about a leadership pipeline for board positions. Now, this comes with a lot of research. I mean, in a recent, let's call it nominations and governance committee, which we have in corporates, we're now looking to, let's call it, appoint new board members. And that would require a bit of research. In the corporate area, you normally would go out and you have search agencies, executive agencies looking at positions. People were given their CVs, they will be interviewed, there'll be psychometric tests, all sorts of things that would help in identifying the right people. And then you end up with a short list of candidates that are presented to the board for interviewing. And that's what I'm talking about. But I think in the non-profit organization, we're not at, let's call it, as successful in having that. And that's what I think it boils down to, having an organization well respected and you be able to have the right candor that would attract people to want to work in that environment. So when you look at an organization that I've been talking about, you have to act as an ambassador. You have to have a passion and energy that you want to give back to the community. And you need to have the right people and you need to commit the time. But by doing that, you're upholding your responsibilities with care, loyalty, and confidence. And in terms of building relationships with individuals outside the organization, it's about making sure you've got contact with the right stakeholders and be helpful and be involved and be in the trenches with the management as well to understand the challenges that impact us. And you would have known with COVID-19 that ultimately working from home does have its own challenges, but it is the new way of working. And it has restricted us from getting out there and serving the community. But there was innovative ways that could be done. And the organization that I was involved in, or still involved in as executive, is the question of MIL-SA, where we had to work around using non-government organizations or non-profit organizations that are across the country and distribute that to the people that are very poor. Ultimately, I think it's about embracing change and being willing to take risks, but also to lead to awards. Anyway, in conclusion, I think I've given you enough perspective of what we talk about in terms of effective leadership in a board. The bottom line is that the effectiveness of the board has a huge impact on the success of the organization. And I encourage you, if you're not already involved in a not-profit organization, to get involved, and for the pleasure of Allah. Thank you, and Jazakallah. Over to you, Maria.
Shukran, Mr. Suleman. You raised some very, very important points in your presentation. I think it's very, very important. One of the critical issues is who should be on that board. and what are the qualities of the persons who should be on that board. And of course, we take a lot of lessons from our very rich Islamic traditions, which gives us a lot to think about in terms of who should be our leaders. What is the kind of characteristics that a particular leader should have? And of course, you should know this better than me, all of those of you who are involved in business and management. It's something I read a long time ago, and it's a basic management principle that the fish rots from the head. So if we are going to have poor leadership and poor leaders, then no matter how strong those foot soldiers are, we're going to have a very failing organization. And I really like the point you make about the establishment of a legal and compliance subcommittee. I think that's something that's really, really needed in the environment we're speaking about. As I'm speaking, you're probably seeing on your screens the second poll question, which is basically in your NPO, is there clarity between the role of the board and management? So you will be answering that particular poll. And while you're doing that, I'm going to introduce to you our next speaker. And as I said previously, we have chosen these experts for you. So our next speaker is very, very well known. But I think it's a disservice when we make the statement that the speaker is so well known that he needs no introduction. I really am not of the view that that's the line I should take. So even if we all know him, let us then celebrate his achievements and, more importantly, the rich experience which he brings to this webinar. So I'm talking about Mr. Shauket Fakie, who also has quite a few degrees under his belt. He has a BCom, a BCom, which is his honors. He's a chartered accountant, very much like our previous speaker. And he is not only qualified in terms of a chartered accountant in South Africa, but also in terms of Australia. So that's a huge feather in his belt as well. And of course, where most of us may have known him from was when he served as the Auditor General for South Africa for a period of about 7 years. And I remember him clearly in that role when he took issue with many of our parliamentarians and the executive members on the issues of expenditure and accountability, etc., because that is the role of the Auditor General at that particular level. And then in 2007, he took on the role of an executive in the Business Risk Management Department of MTN. And he served in that position until he retired in 2015. Now, again, very, very rich in experience, over 40 years of experience in accounting, auditing, consulting, and advisory work, both locally and internationally. And what we must also remember is that Mr. Fakie has served as the chairperson of one of our partners, which is Sanzaf, and currently serves on Sanzaf National Executive. Without much ado, I'm going to hand over to Mr. Shauket Fakie to make his presentation on a very, very important aspect, succession planning. I think it's something that not just Muslim organizations, but many organizations don't really take seriously. So let us hear what Mr. Fakie has to say on this issue.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. And good afternoon to all our listeners and participants. Munira, thanks for those introductory comments. My presentation to you this afternoon is, as Munira indicated, on succession planning. And I will be touching on some of the things that Yunus raised in his presentation regarding the structure and how important the structure is. But the agenda for my presentation is just in 4 parts. One is I'll give you a bit of background. Then we'll talk about some of the pitfalls of poor succession planning, challenges and difficulties people have in NPOs from a succession planning point of view, and what are some of the sound succession planning mechanisms that we can put into place. Next slide, please. Just by way of background, I mean, many MPOs commence with one, two, or handful of individual who have a idea to serve the community, who have the passion and the commitment to serve the community for the pleasure of Allah, and the start of an NPO. Really committed and dedicated to the cause of serving and uplifting humanity. Then they go through a growth phase, and as they go through the growth phase, you find that they either require additional resources in the form of funds, facilities, or people, and they often run into a bit of difficulty during this growth phase and when additional resources, people is required. And I'll touch on some of the difficulties that they experience because of one, not wanting to let go some of the control and power they have at the moment. And secondly, also just, it becomes a bit difficult just growing the organization to the level it should be, needs to be properly resourced. And because of that, they then also sometimes decide that, look, we're growing too fast, we need to consolidate. And they go through a consolidation phase of trying to weed out some of the activities that that doesn't quite serve their core needs or what they originally started off with. Because as they go through the growth phase, they take on a lot more other activities which may be incidental to the core activity that they set themselves out with. The other thing that we need to understand that often when NPOs start up, they are started off by the founding members who have reached a certain, if I can call it age, not in every case, but often they're well over the 50 years of age when they decide to start up an NPO or have a concept to serve the community and give something back to the community. So you find they have about 10, 15 years of good, healthy life in the NPO, and then they start becoming old, frail, and sickly, and often do not want to hand over, the baton or the leadership to the next generation or the people that are in the organization. And we'll talk about some of the fears and concerns regarding that. Just go backwards, please. I'm still back. I just want to go to the previous slide. And what has also been identified is that over 70% of NPOs fail because of a whole lot of factors. And I think Yunus made mention of structure and a whole lot of stuff. But one of the key factors is that there's no succession planning. So there isn't a proper person that can take over when someone becomes old to take the organization to the next level and carry on some of the good work that's been done. And what does this tell us? It tells us a lot in terms of proper planning and succession planning. Next slide. Pitfalls that exist is that NPOs are dependent on one or two individuals. Often the founding members and one or two committed members that are good friends with the founding member that have the same concept, and the NPO becomes very heavily dependent on one or two individuals. They are often committed elderly founding members, and then the structure, mechanism, process, and systems are not there or not sustainable at all because they're trying to do all of those things themselves. And I think Yunus made mention and stressed the importance of structure and processes that needs to be put into place in order to make these NPOs sustainable and to run them at a level that needs to be run. Understand that some of these NPOs are pretty small organizations. They're not of the scale and the size that we know some bigger NPOs are, and therefore those NPOs can afford to have those complicated and massive structures, but still the principle still applies to smaller NPOs. So I'm saying that it may not be to the same level, but the principle should still apply. Next slide. So challenges and difficulties that a number of NPOs have, and in properly planning for succession planning. One of the key factors is that the founding members or the people that are actively involved in the organization want to have full control over the organization, and they want to have full authority over the organization. They do not want to hand over any control. They don't want to delegate any of the authority. Every single check that needs to be signed has to be signed by this individual. Every activity that is taken has to go through and be approved by this particular handful of individuals. So it's an issue of control and authority. Is one of the challenges, difficulties that one has. Lack of trust and confidence. You find that people that are in control and in authority often lack the trust and confidence in other people in order to delegate some of those, delegate some of the functions and activities through to them. As I said, they just want to micromanage and want to have control over everything. The biggest challenge and difficulty that I've experienced with NPOs, and having spoken to a lot of very committed and really, if I can call it, people that sacrifice selfless leaders, is the fear factor. And the fear factor comes from the fact that some of these people have experienced their organization actually being taken over or hijacked, if they call it that way, by allowing new people to come through and actually taking over the organization, kicking off the current executive or management team that's there, and then running the organization the way they want to. And of course, the last challenge and difficulty is that they're often not open to new ideas and change, and that's where the fear factor also comes through. We've done it this way for the last 10 years. Don't come through with your new ideas and change things, because it's worked for us for the last 10 years, and we don't, these new things can cause failure, and therefore we're not open to new ideas. So these are some of the realities and challenges and difficulties that you find NPOs face in terms of the current leadership that's not prepared to hand over or bring in some new blood into the organization. Next slide, please. So what are the sound succession planning mechanisms? I think the first one is the structure, and I think Yunus made quite a bit of reference to this. Without a proper structure, without having people serving the organization both in an executive and a non-executive capacity, you're not going to have good leaders coming through. You're not going to be able to test the quality of people coming through and make sure you guide these people, you groom them, and you shadow them properly so that they are able to take over at a time when the leader of the organization is frail, weak, and needs to step down. Then the second issue, which Yunus also made reference to, is to have servant leadership that inspires the people that they work with, whether it is the stakeholders, whether it is the donors, and whether it is the management team. They need to understand that there are servant leaders that are serving for the pleasure of Allah. The only reason why they do this is to attain the pleasure of Allah. There's no self recognition in this thing. In fact, if you don't get a kick up your butt, then you must consider yourself lucky. That's what Gift of the Givers keeps saying. And I think that's the kind of servant leadership that you need to provide, and also inspire other people to do the same. You need to be open-minded, but of course, cautiously trusting as well. I'm not saying you need to just open up your organization. There is a reality. People have come in with ulterior motives, taken over organization, hijacked organization, but you cannot be closed-minded and not allow any new blood to come in. So you need to be open-minded, cautiously trusting. When you trust somebody, be cautious and make sure you bring in new blood into the NPO. The issue of grooming and shadowing, the structure does allow for that. If you have a vice chairman, for example, it's a clear way of a succession plan where you start grooming the vice chairman to take over as a chairman. If you have an assistant treasurer, again, it's a good way to groom an assistant treasurer to take over the treasury role as and when the position become available and vacant. So grooming and shadowing are the mechanism that we believe you need to put into place as part of your structure to allow new blood and new people to come through. And of course, you need to delegate and guide people in order to take the organization to the next level. You cannot control it when you are sick, and you cannot control the organization from the grave when you passed away. The organization's work and the people that serving the organization need to continue. I think, next slide. In conclusion, the bottom line is that sound succession planning provides sustainability and success for the organization. And I think it is to just take the precautions that I've mentioned, put the mechanisms in place, and inshallah, you'll find that there will be good, dedicated young people that would like to serve the organization if you create the right environment and the right culture within the organization. Jazakallah. Thank you for listening to me. Shukran. Over to you, Munira.
Shukran for that presentation again, Mr. Fakie. I think you also raised some very, very salient points in that presentation, and it reminds me of some of the things that I actually come across as a lawyer as well. Especially with Islamic inheritance, we find that because of this 2:1 ratio where your son gets double the share of a daughter, and then I always advise clients that, look, you can always give to your daughter in your lifetime, and then you can give her everything you want without having to exceed to that 2:1 proportion. And the biggest thing that stops people from doing that is giving up the power they have over the property that they own. And I think that's the very similar concept that we have here that you're talking about, is that, and this may not always be the case, but generally it seems that those who are in those positions of power find it very, very difficult to let go of that power. And the reason I think why they find that so difficult sometimes is because of what you raised as the fear factor. So yeah, they fear that some young upstart may not see the organization and lead it to where it's supposed to be in the manner that it was envisaged, etc. So that's quite an important aspect. But at the other end of that spectrum is if we do not consider what is going to be the future, who are going to be the future leaders, then we're also doing a disservice to the organization. And that whole idea of the fear of having to give up power was very, very well demonstrated now recently in the US elections. And you find that Trump is still fighting the fact that he has lost the election. And I know that some organizations seem to have put in a layering process. So for example, you can become a member of certain committees, but beyond that, if you don't have certain qualities, you're not going to be able to move up into the structures of the organization. Now, for whatever reasons, leaders do that in different organizations, I'm not sure, but I think all the points you raised have to really be considered in how we take our organizations forward. There was the next poll that was up there. So I hope all of you have been answering the poll questions. But what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to deal with a question that has come through, okay? And the very first question that I have is a question that is posed to Mr. Suleman. So, and that's a very, very quick question that you can deal with for us, Mr. Suleman. What should NPOs do to protect their immovable assets?
Okay, Assalamu alaikum once again. I think in terms of immovable assets, I'm specifically talking about land and buildings that non-profit organizations do tend to acquire over time. And the point I'm making, I would like to respond to that question is ultimately, you do always have what we would call an association or a Section 21 company or any other vehicle that may be, let's say, used to set up this organization. And the one thing that I have learned over the years is that ultimately from advice from a senior, let's call it Ulama, that lives near where I stay. And he had told me up front when we were setting up, let's call it a masjid, He said, make sure that you have a separate Waqaf trust, like you got the Awqaf trust. You have set up a separate, let's call it a Waqaf trust, where all your immovable assets are, let's call it, owned in that entity. And that way, it's kind of protecting that for life, you know, for purposes of, let's call it the environment you're working in or you're staying in, you know, there could be a risk that you may not necessarily have it in the right vehicle, and then it could be taken over by, let's call it, people that may not be having the same interests at heart in terms of what the purpose of the organization is set up. So my advice is that in terms of protecting assets, especially immovable assets, it's better to have a Waqaf trust and house it in that vehicle.
Thank you for that. I have a question for Mr. Fakie. Perhaps you can answer that, and then I'm going to carry on with the questions in this manner. I don't want to burden one speaker all the time, so I'm going to alternate the questions, right, as much as I can. Okay, so for Mr. Fakie, I have a question here. Why are NPOs afraid of succession planning and handing over power? I think this is something I raised in my response to your presentation as well. So yes,
Yeah.
Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, Munira, I think you've touched on it. I think the fear factor is a major issue, and as I've indicated in my presentation, that it's an issue of control and not handing over the authority. So those are the things that are the main key factors where people have a fear to hand over the control of the organization to someone that they perhaps do not have the full confidence, and so on and so forth. And often you find that if it's not a family member, there's even a bigger fear factor. You know, it's almost like that organization is a family organization, so the succession has to go from one family member to another, not realizing that it is a public benefit organization and really needs to serve the public by and large. And the leadership has to also change, bringing the public, good leaders from the public into the organization as well.
You actually touched a little bit on a question that came a bit further down. So maybe if you can deal with that now, and then we can go back to another question for Mr. Suleman. But the one question that came up here is nepotism also a risk to an MPO?
Without a doubt. I mean, in that process, you don't look at the qualities and the qualifications of the people who are taking over certain position. The fact that it's a family member, that gives them the right to take over that position from one generation to the next. Whereas, as Yunus has indicated, that if you put a proper structure into place, and in the private sector, you have a proper nominations and elections committee that makes sure that people put onto the board are properly screened, and they meet the qualification, and are able to serve the organization properly and effectively. So yes, nepotism is a big factor, and it not only does it come into bringing in people into the organization. You find the issue of nepotism is very rife in MPOs when it comes to procurement as well. You'll find that some person who's involved in this NPO has got his own private business somewhere in terms of hardware or something like that, and often would want that organization to buy all the hardware material through his business, etc., without going through a proper process. So there's a lot of that rife in the organizations, and I think we need to weed those things out, because part of the failure of these NPOs is also attributable to that. But more importantly, you must understand that when you serve in these organizations, you are serving there with the amana that you carry of trust of the people that contribute to this organization. People contribute to the public money is going into this organization, and you need to make sure that you do not create an iota of trust or confidence in the people that's contributing to the organization. So these kinds of things need to be very carefully managed.
Shukran for that. Another question for Mr. Suleman. Now, the question starts off with post-COVID, and I have to say, when I looked at the question, I'm thinking, when can I say post-COVID? Because we're right in the middle of experiencing COVID right now. But anyway, the question says, post-COVID-19, what should NPOs be doing in order to survive the financial crisis that has come about, obviously, sometimes through COVID in this particular instance, but not always through COVID at other times. But what can they do? This specific question is around post-COVID and how they're going to deal with the financial crisis.
Well, I think first of all, if you look at the current level one, where if you go out now into the big wide world, you'd find that life is becoming more normal. It's not normal, it's becoming more normal. Essentially, we got a new way of living. That's the bottom line. But when you look at COVID, and I would say it in the current environment, there is a lot more need to fund NPOs because there's a lot more people that are now unemployed and need to be either fed or supported in one way or the other. And I think when you look at the current environment, my own view is that from the experience I've learned from Meal SA, is that organizations cannot have the same structure across the country or wherever it is that they want to be party to distributing to the people in need. My own view in terms of, let's call it the lessons learned from this COVID impact is that we should collaborate with each other in the non-profit organization sector. And essentially, we need to look at saving costs. So the saving of costs can either be using the distribution channels that are available to you through collaborating with other organizations across the country. Like even Gift of the Givers, even though they're an international organization, we as Meal SA collaborate with them to distribute the meal to the people that need it. And that way, you're avoiding the costs, let's say, of transportation or having infrastructures on the ground, etc. So that's just one example of how nonprofit organizations, because of the lack of funding, could save costs and still reach the people that I need. And that's what I would say as one example. In terms of funding, they have to face the reality there isn't going to be as much funding available because ultimately there's a lot more people and there's a lot more organizations that have been set up. And in that way, I'm saying, look at the cost effectiveness. And the one thing that I had spotted over the years is that every nonprofit organization has what you would call a back office, whether it's administration, whether it's accounting, whatever it may be. If there could be some way of reducing costs by using what we would call in the corporate world a shared service center, so that all the, let's call it as many nonprofit organizations could work through a shared service center, that'll save them a lot of costs in terms of a back office. And those are things, some ideas of what we need to think about in a post-COVID environment to save costs and still get the job done.
Okay, shukran for that. I have a question now for Mr. Fakie again. Why is the younger generation not so keen to get involved in NPOs and community organizations?
Yeah, I think, Munira, that's quite an interesting question. It's a double-edged sword there. Firstly, you find that the younger generation, the kind of lifestyle that they lead now is, to try and, if I can call it, have very big career aspirations, have also aspirations to accumulate wealth, and are quite busy in achieving those goals and objectives of accumulating wealth and progressing the career in many respects. So you find that the amount of time that they have available to be able to serve NPOs and public organizations is perhaps limited compared to their fathers and forefathers did. The second aspect, so that's the one side of it, and there are some people that are prepared to make that time, by the way. It's not all that's there. The second aspect is within the organization and the leadership within the organization. You find that these youngsters feel that they're not able to contribute constructively in these organizations to bring about new thinking and new way of doing, if I can call it, new way of doing business within, or not business, but new way of serving the community. Often those kinds of ideas are not sort of welcome or they just fall into deaf ears, and therefore they're not able to make a big difference and contribution to the organization. And I think that is why you need an open-minded leadership in these organizations to try and recruit and attract younger generation coming in, because on the one side, the numbers that's coming through is low because of career aspirations, but those that want to serve do get frustrated because of the structures or the lack of structures and the lack of avenues to make a contribution and make a difference within this organization. Yes, Munira, I just want to touch on the point that you asked Yunus earlier, relating to the question that you raised with Yunus regarding how do we become more effective post COVID-19. I mean, one of the other things that we've been doing, again, jointly, as Yunus has indicated, through collaboration, is also trying to avoid duplication, because in the distribution network, we find there's a lot of duplication taking place. You know, there's a number of organizations serving the same community. Today it's Sanzaf that's going through and dropping off food parcels there. Tomorrow it's Al-Fida, and the following day somebody else. So when you do a lot of this collaboration that Yunus referred to, in addition to having the admin cost streamlined, you also can stretch the distribution far better in terms of making sure there's a fairness in the distribution when you collaborate and avoid duplication of distribution as well.
Okay. Shukran for that. I'm going to go back to Mr. Suleman. Very short question here that is being addressed to you. Can a board be overthrown if it's a one-man show?
I suppose it can. A lot depends on the constitution of that organization, whether it has a formal, let's call it, you would call it constitution in normal circumstances, or whether it's a memorandum of incorporation, if it's a company. A lot depends on that regulatory document. And that's something that needs to be looked at. So when it comes to, we call a one-man show, it's not ideal, because then, as Shauket is talking about succession planning, there isn't that succession planning. So a one-man show or a 10-man board could be overthrown if they're not doing their job properly. And if it's a public benefit organization, it can easily be taken over. But as long as it's done in a constructive way, and ultimately it's done for the purpose of what the organization was set up, I think often you'd find it's easier to engage in a discussion around maybe the challenges of having one person or a dominant, let's call it, individual, is to make sure that there's a way of engaging. As long as there's an opportunity to engage and that person is flexible, there's no reason to go and say, let's make it a takeover. It would be better to do it on a negotiated way, to make sure in the way of what the topic is today in succession planning and planning for that over time. So whether it's a one-man or a 10-man, as long as the constitution or the memorandum of incorporation does provide for that, it can be done.
There's a follow-up question here, and before the question is actually posed, there's an observation that the attendee is making, basically saying that in my personal experience, and this attendee is a management consultant, I have found a particular type of personality who works in this field. So she's basically saying that in this field, you have to have a certain type of personality to operate in it. And that if you are in the government sector, then again, you have a particular kind of personality to operate in the government sector. And her observation is that, do you need a certain type of profile in order to be on the board of a particular MPO? Or are these just simple human characteristics which rear its head all the time, characteristics of fear, poor leadership skills, etc.? What's your comments on that, Mr. Suleman?
Yeah, I don't think it's a specific personality. I think it's about upbringing, if you think about it. It's about the want to give back. You know, as we clearly say, as a non-profit organization, there's no financial benefit to people wanting to commit their time and get involved in organizations. And the personality is very much driven by some, let's call it, upbringing that we may come across. And the bottom line is, if you have been through difficult times and you want to be use an opportunity of your success to give back to the community through using a non-profit organization, you will be very passionate to do it effectively. So I don't think a person would have the characteristic, whether it's in a government organization or a private organization or a public listed company, it all depends on what your personal passion is on giving back to communities in need. And that's where I think it depends on the opportunities and the ability, financially and commitment of time, that people use to give back. I mean, I had an example recently where someone wanted to meet me, and literally he had to remind me that he had a problem with renal dialysis. He needed renal dialysis urgently and he couldn't afford it. And I had arranged through, let's call it the Islamic Medical Association, that that person could get funded through the IMA and get the renal dialysis that he needed. And then after a year, he then joined a medical aid. And that's the condition. You can't join a medical aid until you've had, let's call it treatment and that sort of thing. But he wanted to meet me to thank me. Now, to me, I didn't do it with a self-interest or expecting some reward. It was a need to help someone. And that was what it was done. But the reality was, it's like a personality or a trait or characteristic. It all depends you as an individual. It's not based on where you've come up or where you're working or anything that for that matter. It's your personal commitment to help people in need. And that's, I think, would be my response to that question.
Okay, I think it makes a lot of sense then. I think what that particular question was raising is perhaps personalities do get into the way. And so is it that specific types of personalities tend to congregate in these boards or whatever? But very, very interesting response. I have questions now, well, a few of them that are directed at Mr. Fakie. So let's move to him. The first one is, should successes be nurtured and mentored from within the organization organically, or should we be headhunting our successes?
Yeah, there isn't a clear right or wrong in this regard. I think you should be doing both, in my view. I think initially, I mean, if you're headhunting, you need to make sure you know the profile of the person that you're bringing in from externally quite well. There is a alignment, there's a cultural fit between the person that's coming through externally and the organization and its goals and objectives. So there isn't an a one size fit all. Often you find that because of the issue of fear and this cultural fit issue and different objective issue, etc., you find it is sometimes safer, better to grow your people from within and then bring them up to the level that you want to. But that is not necessarily the only answer. I mean, if there is a good person out there that served organization, that's got a hell of a good track record, that's got the right profile, that is committed and passionate about serving the people in the community, and whose cultural fit fits in with the organization goals and objectives, then I think there's nothing stopping you from bringing that person in to the organization as well.
The follow-up to that is, well, often the headhunted are not very au fait with the internal operations of the organization, or not attuned to the ethos and the vision of the organization. So if we do headhunt, and this is a particular problem, how can this be addressed?
Yeah, I think you need a handover period. You need a period of grooming, notwithstanding the fact that you bring someone in externally, and you need that person to understand the DNA, the ethos, and the culture within the organization, and then eventually hand over full control and authority to that person. I don't think it, it would be a good idea just to bring someone in and just give them a blanket authority to run the organization. You need to have that handover and proper grooming in order to avoid that kind of pitfall.
Sometimes you probably would be doing both, right? You'd probably be headhunting within the capable candidates in the organization. So Yeah, I think that makes quite a bit of sense then. The whole idea of mentoring them and a period within which to grow them into that particular position. We're going to go back now to Mr. Suleman, where the founders have left off. So generally you have, our founders who have started off the organization. I remember Mr. Fakie making this point in the beginning of his presentation. So the founders have left off. For the successors, it seems that that passion and drive is not the same as it was for the founders. Sometimes for the successors, this is merely a job that they have to perform. And so that passion and drive is actually lacking. How can one actually inculcate this passion and drive for the ones who have taken over after the founders?
Well, I'll tell you from my personal experience. I was involved in an organization for a number of years, and then I handed over the reins to someone else who at that point in time was the deputy chairman. And I think it went pretty well over the years since that. I mean, the person ran it for another 6 to 8 years. But then there came a point where, let's put it this way, a couple members came back to me and said, you know what, we need some energy here, we need some action, and we haven't made much progress over the number of years. So can you come back and get involved? And that's possible. I mean, at the end of the day, I got it back involved, and I'm, running the organization currently. And we're trying to move a bit further down the track and get things done faster. So I think it's all about making sure that people that do have the energy and the passion do come back and resuscitate maybe if there was a bit of a slack in the actual energy and passion, or could continue to be mentors of those people to get the energy levels back again. So I think that's something that can be done. It's not a train smash. And getting back to the question of succession as well, and the topic that Shauket is talking about, I would say it's so much more challenging to get people to commit their time and to mentor them and train them up and develop them to take the organization to another level. My own view is that I don't think people should be in positions for too long. It's like between 2 and 4 years is enough time for someone to do whatever has to be done and hand it over to someone new. And that way, the new people do come in with a lot of different ideas, and it does help in getting to new heights. So it's all about encouraging people and creating an environment where people get excited to be involved in an organization currently. And that's a big challenge, especially now in the current environment where people are working from home. It's even more difficult to get them to commit their time to do other things, because now they are available 24/7 to their work employers, and they don't have any time for anything else. But in the current environment, it kind of does impact people's mental health. And so you've got to encourage people to sort of provide time for non-work related activities. And that way they can then be available to commit their time to nonprofit organizations as well.
Yeah, it's clearly the case of the fact that transferring skills is so much easier than having to inspire values and passion and interest, etc. But of course, there are very different ways of doing that, and the mentoring process is one way, the one that Mr. Fakie referred to as well, where you have a sort of handing over period, etc., can build all of these things. I have one more question for you before I move to Mr. Fakie again. And this basically is asking, will having the role of a non-executive chairperson work for an Islamic NPO? And the reason why this question is being raised is because often the chairperson can be somebody very dominant, authoritarian, and then probably dominates discussion, whereas a non-executive chairman manages the meetings in a far more equitable manner. So what is your view to this?
Definitely. I would definitely encourage a non-executive, and I would call it even more than that, an independent non-executive. And that I think is critical, because when you look at independence, it's critical because then the person is not involved in any, call it, executive responsibilities at the organization. So it's clearly an oversight role. And that was the purpose of an independent non-executive. You can't have that person be a person that's running the organization from an operational point of view, especially organizations that are involved in distribution or involved in other activities that literally uplift disadvantaged communities, as an example. I'm not talking about masjids now. I'm talking about, sort of non-profit organizations that are there to uplift people. You definitely need a non-executive, and more specifically, an independent person. And like Shauket mentioned, that if someone now got a hardware store on the side and he's supplying the hardware to the organization and making the profit, then that person is not independent. So I would definitely encourage people to have an independent non-executive, and in a way that you can't appoint or elect people just for 1 year. You've got to give them a 2-year or a 4-year term, and that way you can actually make sure you're getting the maximum value, or they can implement initiatives through that period, but with the proper oversight of a non-executive group of board members.
Shukran for that. I have a question now for Mr. Fakie. And this is actually a follow-up question on I think I asked it to you right up in the beginning about getting young people involved, right? But this is basically saying here, how are we going to get our madrasas, Darul Ulums to train and motivate students to participate in NPOs? The challenge is we have Muslims who don't want to get involved, right? So we have so many skilled Muslims who contribute nothing basically because they don't want to get involved. So how can we get, I think, younger people involved in these particular organizations and at that particular level?
Yeah, I think as I've indicated in my presentation, I think you need a servant leadership who inspires. So I think that's the first thing. You need the kind of leaders leading these organizations that are servant leaders that inspire people, both young and people around them. Number two, you need to create an environment within the organization on the values, the culture, and how important it is to serve the community, and how important it is for youngsters to start at a young age to be contributing towards the upliftment of the community. I think those are important values that we need to inculcate in the youngsters. And as Yunus has mentioned, it's something that you grow up with, but I think this, to some extent, these are kinds of things that need to be taught in madrasas and even in private sector at universities, that you're getting all this education. Do not forget the community. There are a number of people, particularly in this country of ours, there's a lot of people below the breadline, and we are very fortunate that we've been given the opportunity to get the education, and that we need to plow something back into the community. So I think that's the first element of trying to bring younger people into the organization and create a culture and an environment where young people feel the need and feel that they are making a difference by contributing and serving this organization. Just one example in this regard, Munira, for the listeners. We in Pietermaritzburg, and I think there are a couple of other offices of Sanzaf, what we do is we provide bursaries to students to become educated, get the university degrees, and in fact try and place them in good jobs as well post-university. But we don't make it a condition, because as you know, from a Zakat point of view, you can't make it a condition. Zakat is unconditional. If the person is entitled to Zakat, then that's what you're going to give them. But again, we go out and reach out to the students that got the assistance, and we're able to achieve something from being eligible for Zakah and having reached the kind of heights that they've reached, to come back and serve the organization and go and reach out to other youngsters to either go and qualify or to serve the organization. And I think that's another way that organizations can go about without making it a precondition, to encourage students that you've made a difference in their lives, that they come back and make a difference in the lives of other youngsters.
Munira, can I add something to something I said earlier?
Sure. Please do.
It's actually linked to a question that's on the Q&A chat as well. When I talk about a board, I'm talking about a board that comprises of the majority of members of that board are non-executive. Normally you would have, let's say if you've got an 8-member board, only 2 members may be from executive management, and that's normally the CEO or the CFO, or both. and the rest of them are non-executive. They don't have any operational responsibility other than being non-executives that play an oversight role. The second point I had made earlier was the question of, let's say, being appointed or elected for a 2 to 4 year period. That what I'm talking about is specifically for the board, not for the executive that run the organization. And so essentially, the executive management don't have to be limited to the 2 to 4 year period. It's the non-executive board members that are elected for a period of either 2 years or 4 years, or whatever period the actual constitution provides for.
Yeah, but the whole idea of getting the younger generation in is a huge challenge. I agree. And I know even at the organization that I serve on, AMAL, what we've basically started is student chapters. So all universities have a law school and they have a business school. So we're now starting, or we started quite a few, but we're starting these chapters where the students then from a very, very early sort of beginning point are actually getting involved at an organizational level, and they do so and participate at a level that they're growing in at that particular point in time. So they participate as students, etc., etc. But really, I do agree that it is a huge challenge. But don't go away, Mr. Suleman, because I have one question here that's sort of flashing at me, and I know it must be addressed by you. And I know that this whole program is geared at corporatizing NPOs, right? Muslim NPOs specifically. But the whole idea of corporatization is something that people are very negative about. I know personally that when the university moved into embracing corporate principles and started a performance management program, there was huge negativity as well. And the question here, well, it's not so much a question, but rather a comment. Boards must stop running organizations like a business. Now, I think that you need to comment on this, because really this is the antithesis of what we're basically trying to do here. We're saying that you need to run these particular NPOs as a corporate institution.
Just to respond to your point about the youth not getting involved, right? And I've done this before as well. I got involved in, they call it a global youth wing, and set it up and talk to people. And I got a few people very excited because the benefit that can be reached or achieved by youth or teenagers to get involved in an organization is that they can learn from us. I personally didn't know how much of knowledge I have unless someone asked me a question. And that's the important thing, that teenagers or youth or anyone for that matter can gain a lot by actually working with those people that are experienced and help to share that knowledge. Getting back to the question of whether an organization, a public benefit organization, should be run as a corporate. If you look at it, the funding comes from the public. It's the amanat given to the board to make sure that that public money is spent wisely and is not wasted. And it gets to the people that it's targeted for. Now, if you look at, let's say, Zakat, I mean, when organization that I've been involved in, we made a commitment when we got involved is that 100% of the Zakat must be distributed. Nothing must go towards administration. And my role in that organization had to make sure that 100% is distributed. Now that comes from a corporate experience that I have. And therefore you try and inculcate it in an organization so that the principles or the policies and procedures, whether you're a public benefit organization or whether you're a public listed company or a private company, are the same. There's no difference. The reality is you have to have empathy, you have to work with people that may not have the leadership experience or the leadership skills. They may not be taught that in whichever academic institution they come from. And it's up to us to help empower them, but to also guide them and give them, let's call it support, but also help develop them. So it's a combination. I wouldn't say you can't do that. You have to look at what's best for the organization and how do you make sure that the ultimate objectives of the organization are still being executed using the experience of everyone on the board. You can't say that corporate skills or corporate structures can't work. It can work, but there needs to be a blend of it. And there must be a commitment to use that experience that people may have to implement the right policies and procedures to achieve the vision and the objectives of the organization.
Thank you so much for that. I have a last, it's not really a comment, but it's a suggestion. But I'm going to throw this suggestion out to both our speakers for today to give their closing remarks on this and whatever other closing remarks they would like to make. But this is coming from our participant who hails all the way from Indonesia, and basically is saying that she found this particular discussion a very, very important one for her, and that it should be spread to NPOs worldwide. And she says that she's just thinking, can we not establish an international association for Islamic NPOs? So I'm going to ask each one of you to comment on that, and then we're going to move towards the closure of the program for this afternoon.
I think it's a great idea. I think it's a lot that links to what we've spoken about in terms of collaboration. I think each organization in different countries have different strengths and weaknesses. And I think that when it comes to, let's say, opportunities to help communities, especially if you look at the relief agencies that provide, let's call it support in disasters, whether it's floods or earthquakes or whatever, by having that international group of NPOs, you can provide that necessary support through that collaboration platform that would be the benefit coming out of an international IPO association.
Yeah,
Mr. Fakie?
Munira, from my side, I think it's a very good suggestion, proposal that's been put through by the participant from Indonesia. And I think, you know, within our organization, we try to collaborate at the international level. But I think what she's asking for is on a much broader and wider scale. And I'm sure with the networks and the contacts both Sanzaf has, Awqaf has, and many other organizations has, there may be an appropriate platform internationally to try and share this experience and share these ideas and also learn from one another. So I think it's a very good suggestion.
And I think it's a really good note for us to end this on, because it's also giving us some way of how we take this forward. And so to our grand organizations, to Mr. Zainul Kaji and Mr. Suleman Badat, here's one more session for you to add on to your future programs in terms of how we grow the support structures for NPOs at an international level. I thank you all for attending this particular session this afternoon. And I want to just say a few words of thanks to a few people. And of course, gratitude is a huge part of what we believe in as human beings. And I commence by saying shukran to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for allowing this program to happen. And I say thank you to all the partners for giving me the opportunity of managing the program this afternoon. We obviously have to thank our expert panelists, Mr. Yunus Suleman, Mr. Shauket Fakie, for sharing their knowledge, their experience, and for inspiring us in many different ways as well. Thank you to all the attendees. Without you, this would not have been possible. So thank you for making the time on a Saturday afternoon, which is generally family time, to join and share and learn with us. And a huge thank you to Zainul Kaji from Awqaf and Suleman Badat, who are obviously the parents of this program, if I might put it that way, because like I said in the beginning, this is their little baby. They've given birth to it. And we're seeing how this baby is growing into what a lovely project. And now look, we have the grand idea of an international link with various different international NPOs. Thank you, Hasanain, for all the backstage work that you've been doing for us and for producing this webinar. To our Qari, Tanzilur Rahman, shukran for that beautiful recitation of the verses from the Quran. And of course, we also want to thank iSkills for their technical assistance with collating the questions and answers. Please do remember that there's an evaluation that you need to complete. I'm not sure exactly how that happens, but I do know Hasnain has alerted me to that fact that there is an evaluation that you need to complete. So please do complete that evaluation and look out for the future programs that are going to be coming through on this particular series of webinars on corporate governance for Islamic NPOs. Shukran. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu.